This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Starting the show today is Kansas Farm Service Agency Chief Program Specialist Todd Barrows with updates from FSA about programs and the Farm Bill. Kansas Forest Service Fuel Specialist Luke Berning keeps the show rolling by explaining why people might want to stack brush piles differently. He also reminds listeners of when is the appropriate time and place to burn piles. Brad White, Bob Larson, Phillip Lancaster, and Brian Lubbers from K-State's Beef Cattle Institute wraps up today's show. The group converses about coccidiosis and how producers can manage it during weaning. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Wednesday show with Chief Program Specialist from the Kansas Farm Service Agency, Todd Barrows. Todd, thanks for joining us today.
Hi, Shelby. And it's great to be back here with you today and say hello to all of our listeners out there across the state. You know, whether you're tuning in from your combine cab or your tractor or having another cup of coffee, we are happy that you are joining us today as we talk about some important agri issues that are affecting us at this point in time. We know this is a busy season for all you producers, so please take an extra minute and be safe out there. As we move into fall, I wanted to bring up producers' updates on payment schedules for ARC PLC payments, and also just a little bit about the Farm Bill implications starting October the 1st.
And you mentioned ARC and PLC, and we've talked a little bit about it on this show. So these payments are for the 2023 program year, correct?
Yep, that is correct, Shelby. We always pay a year in the rear under the current ARC PLC program for spring planted crops, and the reason why we do that is because of the marketing year. So spring planted 2023 crops, remember their marketing year just ended August the 31st. K-State and other economists have published potential payments based on marketing year weighted average price. And remember, this is a weighted average price, meaning the volume of grain sold at a specific dollar value or price affects the average. Producers can log into fsa.usda.gov, and there is a public ARC PLC page located under the Programs and Services tab where they can see the 2023 program year payment maps starting October the 1st. The national office will be updating those new 2023 payment maps here this week. I can share in Kansas, unfortunately, we will not see payments under the program base acres allowed with the PLC or price loss coverage option for 2023. However, depending on your Pacific County and base acres on your farms, producers could receive payments under the ARC County program option. Payments are projected again, as I stated, to be processed on October the 7th. For those producers who have acres enrolled in the Conservation Reserve Program, or commonly CRP, those annual payments, our rental payments, are scheduled to be processed on Wednesday, October the 9th.
And something important to the Farm Service Agency, the Farm Bill, and you mentioned a little bit. Is there anything you can share with our listeners?
Most of you are probably aware that we have been operating under a one-year extension of the 2018 Farm Bill legislation, and that will expire on September the 30th. And with that, we do not have authorization to process some normal activities until that legislation is either extended or a new farm bill is passed by Congress. So what that means is county offices will not be authorized to restore any farm base acres that are associated with CRP contracts that may expire or are voluntarily terminated or producer requested early release beginning October the 1st. However, county offices can still process any farm operation changes moving forward for the 25 program year. Some of those may include land changes, owner-operator changes to farms, or if you have an entity in which you conduct your farming operation, membership may have changed due to retirement or due to a death of a member of that entity. So those general maintenance items can be updated at this time. Producers should still be reporting their planted crop acreage this fall, including wheat seeded acres or cover crop acres. And then also I wanted to mention the Non-Insured Assistance Program, or commonly the NAP program. That is still also authorized, providing crop protection for those crop acres that are not insurable through federal crop insurance. So we're mainly talking here about our producers that do the fall planted vegetable crops. Could be your orchard groves, such as your fruit trees and nut trees. And also, we don't want to forget about our livestock grazing crops. Those applications for that coverage are still applicable and can still be obtained as necessary. And also, last of all, your livestock and crop disaster programs are still authorized, and those will continue as well. The important thing that I want to remind the producers of, Shelby, is I wish there was a simple one answer to fit all questions regarding what programs are available and which ones aren't because of the lapse in the Farm Bill. There's not. So when in doubt, or if you have a question, listeners, make sure to reach out to your local office, and they can help you out with that.
With the future of the Farm Bill, any update on status, Todd?
I really can't share a whole lot, and that's really not because I don't want to. It's just because most of what I hear is still just rumors, like what the producers are hearing and what's going out through the different news media outlets. But what I can share is I was at a production outlet conference in Kansas City a couple weeks ago and listened to comments made by the USDA Undersecretary for Farm Production and Conservation Programs. And a couple of highlights that he really drove home that day was the fact that they are really looking to increase a land enrolled in what they call working conservation programs. So what that means is the land would still be in production, but also would be able to receive conservation incentive benefits. And also then the next thing that is continuing to move forward is dealing with carbon credits and how can we have a cleaner environment moving forward.
Anything else when it comes to FSA programs you'd like to share with us today?
Just kind of as a wrap-up today, I do want to put out a couple reminders. The first one has to deal with our dairy producers regarding the availability of assistance in case of loss of milk production resulting in removing dairy cows from your milking cycle due to a recent outbreak of the H5N1 avian influenza. And as long as you have to remove a cow or multiple cows from one milking cycle, you could be eligible for benefit. Additionally, along with that, through APHIS, there is money available to help with the cost of testing for H5N1 avian influenza in your herd. And they also have money available to help pay for the shipping costs for those tests to go to an approved laboratory for confirmation. Your local veterinarian can help you with these APHIS funds, and then, of course, stop by your local FSA office, and they can help you once you have a confirmed outbreak with milk loss policies. And finally, the last thing I really wanted to mention was we have had recent changes in our farm loan programs that we believe will be beneficial or will help our borrowers in a variety of ways. So if you are interested in financing, whether that be for land or equipment through FSA, please check with your local FSA office, and they will direct you to one of our 21 farm loan offices in Kansas. Those are spread out across the state, and we do offer direct loans as well as some guaranteed loans through commercial lenders to those producers that would be eligible. So again, if you're looking for another avenue for financing, be sure to check in with FSA, and we can help you potentially there through our farm loan program.
And as always, when the Farm Service Agency is on, wanting to remind people where they can always find more information.
You can always reach out to your local county office, and you can always go online. Again, that is to USDA-fsa.gov, and that's a public forum page, and click on programs and services available, and there's just you can find information on all of our different programs that we administer at that site.
Todd, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you, Shelby. It's great to be with you.
That was Chief Program Specialist for the Kansas Farm Service Agency, Todd Barrows. As always, you can find out more information from FSA at Farmers.gov. Before we cut to a break, we're now going to be joined by Kansas Livestock Association's Scarlett Maydinger.
Senators Jerry Moran and Roger Marshall and Representatives Tracy Mann and Ron Estes brought forth legislation to prevent the federal government from using eminent domain authority for a proposed national interest electric transmission corridor. The legislation comes in response to the U.S. Department of Energy's announcement of a proposed corridor extending through large parts of Kansas, which once established would allow the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to utilize eminent domain authority to site electric transmission lines, even if state regulatory authorities had denied an application. Senators Moran and Marshall made clear that decisions regarding new transmission lines in Kansas should be left to the state, not Washington, D.C. Congressman Mann also expressed his disapproval, stating he strongly opposed any effort by the federal government to seize private land. He said any land given to the federal government for this project should be voluntary, not mandated. As introduced, the legislation would ban federal funds from being used to condemn private property to be used in a national interest electric transmission corridor designation and prohibit the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission from using its authority to overrule a state regulator's rejection of an electric transmission project. KLA supports this legislation based on longstanding policy to protect landowners' private property rights. I'm Scarlett Maydinger.
We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show thinking about burn piles with Kansas Forest Service fuel specialist Luke Berning. Luke, thanks for joining us today.
Absolutely. I'm happy to. Thanks for having me.
Luke, as we're thinking about burn and brush piles, why might a producer want to have one of these on their property?
Sure. So in Kansas, no matter what kind of land you have, whether you have rangeland, whether you have timber, whether you are a homeowner with a few acres, if you own land, you should be managing that land. And inevitably, here in Kansas, if you allow it, woody vegetation will take over. That's just succession. We start out with, weeds and forbs, and that transitions into grasses, and over the years, that'll transition into brush and eventually trees. And so some of that can be desirable. We do have woody species that are native to Kansas and provide a lot of benefits. And depending on your objectives and for the landscape, maybe you want to have a lot of nice oaks out on your property. Maybe you're managing for that. Maybe you have a timber stand and you've got some nice timber in there. But a lot of the time, if we are not actively managing our properties, what comes up are undesirable species. Species of brush, eastern red cedar, in the timber, things like hackberry, hedge, locust, that for most of our management objectives, they're not desirable. And so if we're actively managing our property, we've got to do something about that. And so as we think about, hey, I've got this woody species on my property, say it's a bunch of hedge coming up in a pasture. You don't want those out there. You're managing it for cattle, and you're going to lose your grass if you let that take over. Well, the hedge is there. You got to do something with it. So you got a few options. You can either mulch it. If it's small enough, you can get a skid steer out there and chip it up. You can cut it and haul it away. If somehow you have good access to a dump site and it's not incredibly inefficient to haul brush. There are some situations where that is the case. But for almost everyone else, the truly feasible option is to pile it and burn it. That's the only true efficient option available to most folks. And so that's why we're out there building burn piles, is because we're actively managing our land. We have this problem, this inevitable problem that over time woody species will encroach, some of them desirable, some of them undesirable, and we've got to do something about it. So we build burn piles.
Luke, today talking about building those burn piles and not really burning them because it's not this time of year. So where might producers or people want to put the burn piles?
So as you're, starting to get out there and build brush piles, you really want to make sure that it's in a location where you can actually burn it. I've seen brush piles put underneath power lines, and immediately that brush pile is unburnable. I've seen brush piles put up against cedar thickets that's got a house on the other side. Immediately that brush pile is immediately unburnable. And so just taking a second to think, hey, where should this thing go? Where can I actually burn it? A good way to help you think about that is to create a written burn plan for your burn piles, just like you would if you were doing a prescribed fire across a pasture. Writing a burn plan for your burn piles will help you think through, where should I put this thing? Where will I actually be able to burn it? Other factors you want to consider is you're probably going to sterilize the soil for a number of years if the pile is of any size. And so is it in a site where if the soil is sterile and not really growing anything for a few years, is that going to wash? Is it in an erodible area? That's probably not a good spot to do that. And also making sure that we are at least 300 feet away from any structures, and we have a way to clear around the pile to make it easy to control that burn once it gets going. We don't want to put a pile in the middle of a bunch of tall grass that we can't mow. That's going to be highly likely to escape. Things like that. Thinking through where you put your pile before you start stacking things, because it's a lot easier to stack it in the right place than to have to move it.
And are there ways that maybe people should be stacking this brush pile together?
Sure. That depends on what you're going to do with the pile. Some folks know that they will be able to burn their piles, and some folks are in places where they just can't burn them. And so if you're in a place where you can't burn them, then my suggestion would be to stack the pile more loosely versus if you're in an area where you're going to want to burn that pile, then I would suggest stacking it as tight as possible. The reason for that is that many of our wildlife species that we consider desirable will use a loosely stacked pile for cover, for habitat. Bobwhite quail are a great example that if we have a loosely stacked pile that they can move around in, it can be valuable habitat for a number of years. If we tightly stack a pile, it becomes habitat, it becomes a den site for our mesopredators, the nest predators that can put a thumping on many of our desirable bird species like raccoons and possums, some coyotes. And so we don't want to have a bunch of tightly stacked piles on the landscape if we know we're not going to burn them. But if we're going to burn, tightly stacked is the way to go.
And one big one or a bunch of little ones?
Depends on the site. So I prefer a large pile because it's simpler. There's less to keep track of. However, that pile is going to burn more intensely. And so if you're in an area where an intense pile burn, sending up a bunch of embers would be a concern, then having a lot of small piles may be a better way to go. It's more to keep track of and more to monitor. However, those piles that are smaller will burn less intensely and less likely to it's going to send up fewer embers that could cause an escape.
And are there things that maybe we shouldn't put in a brush pile?
My answer is anything that isn't woody vegetation. Just for personal safety, hey, it's never a good idea to burn plastics. You're going to inhale some of the smoke off of that pile. Inhaling smoke from burning plastics is a great way to set yourself up for cancer. Same thing with tires. You see tires in there all the time. Legality aside, that's just not a good idea for you to be breathing that smoke. Anything except for woody vegetation really shouldn't be in a burn pile.
And Luke, we mentioned today not thinking about burning them, but just putting them together. So when should people be burning them?
That is a great question. So traditionally, our guidance has been that folks should burn piles in the winter after we get a heavy snow. However, that guidance is no longer valid because our snows don't stick around like they used to. In the last decade, we've seen that when we get a snow, it may last 2 or 3 days at most. We rarely have a snow that lasts longer than that. And so if we go out there and we burn a pile with a heavy snow on it, that pile will likely smolder for at least a week. And so the kind of danger zone time frame where that pile is retaining heat and has the potential to cause an escape is consistently lasting past the time period that our snow provides protection. And so now what's happened is we've gone out and we've burned this pile with a nice snow on. The snow has melted off, and that heat source, that burned pile that's probably still smoldering and has embers and is just waiting for winds to pick up and humidities to drop, is surrounded by dead fine fuels. It takes our grasses, our dead grasses, only 1 hour to equalize with the atmospheric moisture of the environment around them. And so all that's to say, it doesn't take long for our grasses to dry out. We could have a great snow. 2 days later, if conditions are right, that grass is ready to take off and run just like a spring wildfire. And so we have been really recommending folks to burn during the May to June timeframe. That's because our grasses are green, full of moisture, and it's the lowest ignitability. They're at their lowest ignitability of the entire year. They are green, they are growing, and they are not going to, it's going to be very hard to catch them on fire. And if they do, it's very easy to stop and escape. Whereas in that, post-snow winter time frame, once the snow's gone, that grass is ready to go. So May to June is really when folks should be thinking about lighting piles.
Any last thoughts you'd like to share with our listeners when it comes to burning brush piles?
As a closing thought, if anyone has concerns, questions over anything to do with prescribed fire or wildfire, please feel free to reach out to myself at the Kansas Forest Service and the rest of our fire program staff. We are here to serve the state, and we would love to help landowners who are interested in managing their properties safely, reducing their wildfire risk with any questions that they have.
Luke, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and share with us some information when it comes to putting together brush piles.
Absolutely, anytime.
That was Kansas Forest Service Fuel Specialist Luke Berning. If you'd like to get into contact with Luke, you can do so by his email, which is lrberning@ksu.edu. That is lrberning@ksu.edu. You can contact other people from the Kansas Forest Service by finding their contact information on their website at kansasforest.org. If you're also wanting to find out more information about conducting a safer burn pile, you can check out their recent Kansas Canopy podcast episode where Luke joined Ariel Whiteley-Knoll as they discussed conducting a safer burn pile. You can find that through their website or by searching for Kansas Canopy on Apple Podcast or Spotify. I will link all this in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we round out our Wednesday show with K-State's Beef Cattle Institute's Brad White, Bob Larson, Phillip Lancaster, and Brian Lubbers.
Talk a little bit about coccidiosis, which sometimes we'll think of in calves with bloody diarrhea post-weaning. And Bob, I want to turn to you on this one and say, tell us what coccidiosis is, and then we'll get into some of the specifics of how we want to manage it.
Well, coccidiosis is an internal parasite, although when we typically talk about internal parasites, we're thinking more of the roundworms and worms. It's a single-cell organism that'll burrow into the intestinal wall and can cause some damage there. The organism is really, really common. It can survive in dirt pretty well. It can survive in animals at a low level and not cause a lot of problems. So it's kind of one of those issues that because you have cattle, they're at least exposed to it. Now, being exposed to the coccidia organisms and having, a disease problem are two different things. And so although it is possible to see coccidiosis in a number of different ages or production settings, probably where I see it most commonly is in recently weaned calves. We've done a number of things. We've changed their diet. A lot of times we move them into a dry lot. They've gone through the stress of weaning and those types of things. And those are the types of things that will allow what is normally a small small level of coccidia in the animal to kind of get a foothold and cause problems. And then the hallmark sign is that it will cause a bloody diarrhea. And so if you see blood-tinged diarrhea in that age of calf, it's coccidiosis becomes really high on my rule-out list.
Very few things we would expect bloody diarrhea. Now, we can see dietary changes, and Phillip, I guess, maybe help us distinguish as we're getting onto a starter diet with calves post-weaning, we may have some looser stools than what we might see when they're out on pasture. But tell me what would maybe distinguish, okay, as I'm going through dietary changes versus actual disease state. What would you expect to see?
Well, with the dietary change it's going to be loose, but it should have some consistency to it. Diarrhea was going to be much more watery. And I don't have as much experience with you as you guys probably do, but my experience with it is that when you have the coccidiosis, it's a dark stool because you got the blood being digested and whatever in the intestine, and so it becomes a very dark stool. And so that you don't normally see when you're transitioning calves to a grain type diet.
Yeah, because it'll be typically a lighter color, and maybe even while loose will be a little bit thicker. And there's lots of people that have characterized stools in different ways, right? Mm-hmm. Before whether it's diarrhea or really thick. And I think in coccidia, you certainly can see the blood there. You see several calves affected. It's a parasite. So, Brian, what do we do for treatment in some of these, assuming I've got a group of calves and there's a handful of them out there that have a problem?
Yeah, so the first step is, I know we've talked about bloody diarrhea versus diet change versus diarrhea, but probably the first step is just get the diagnosis. It's a really
great point.
It's an easy diagnosis to make. Take a fecal sample, you send it, they look for coccidia organisms, and if you see them, you're probably about as close to 100% diagnosis as you get in veterinary practice. So that would be the very first step. In all these things, that Bob and Phillip have talked about, if you have a group of calves that are affected and they're at weaning age, that's a pretty high risk, but I'd still confirm it. But there are a couple treatments that are labeled for coccidiosis. So Amprolium would be one, and the ionophores would be another one that you could potentially use, just depending on the situation. You've got a couple options there for feed versus water, how you want to manage your cattle, or how you can manage those cattle. But those are kind of your typical label treatments. There are some others too.
Yeah, so we can do some of those, and sometimes we'll talk about ionophores as both treatment and preventative, so that I try to avoid a break. And those ionophores have some other benefits that we want to have those in their diets as they start on their feed. So appreciate you guys sharing information on coccidiosis. So things to watch for, potentially bloody diarrhea, as Brian mentioned, work with your veterinarian, get a confirmed diagnosis. And if you've had coccidia in the past, Bob mentioned it's very hardy in the environment, probably going to have exposure to it again. So have a plan for how you're going to prevent it.
That was part of the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.